Hello there, welcome to this video presentation, revision catch-up presentation on our inquiry, The World Turned Upside Down, what can sources reveal about England between 1640 and 1660? So we began our inquiry by looking at this source which was produced in 1646. Now it's a woodcut and gives us the impression that England was changing a great deal, a lot during this time. England had been fighting a civil war between King and Parliament from 1642 to 1646. Only 3 years later, King Charles I would be executed and England would become a Commonwealth run by Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell. This was a time period of great change and radical ideas with groups such as the Levellers, Diggers and Puritans. But despite the radical change, views towards women did not change much, and women such as Lucy Hay and Eleanor Davis, who we've learnt about, were still living in a sexist society. In terms of chronological focus, we've been looking at the key events in the 17th century, and we can see some really important events here. So the rule of King Charles I began in 1625 and he ruled until 1649. The date of 1640 is crucial because that was when Parliament was recalled, and then we had the lead up to the English Civil War, which began in 1642. First English Civil War lasted from 1642 until 1646. Now we had a very brief restart of the Civil War in 1648 when Parliament defeated the King's forces at the Battle of Preston, and then the King was executed in the most dramatic event of this 20-year time period on 30th January 1649. The time period from 1649 to 1660 is known as the Interregnum or the Commonwealth. England became what's called a republic. It had no monarchy whatsoever, and the dominant character during this time was Oliver Cromwell, who'd made his name as a cavalry commander in the new model army. He became known as Lord Protector. Oliver Cromwell died in 1658. England became quite turbulent, and in the end, in May 1660, Charles II returned to become the King of England in an event known as the Restoration, and we've had a monarch ever since. So they're the main events, and that's the chronological focus of the key events of this inquiry. In terms of key concepts for this inquiry for us to look at, we'll start off just by thinking about the two key concepts of source and interpretation. So a source means evidence from the time of an event, such as a diary, a newspaper. An interpretation is the view of an historian formed by using historical sources. So when we read history books, then we are focusing on them and talking about them as interpretations. Other key concepts to go through: authority is the ability to give orders and control people. A civil war, a war between two groups within the same country. The Commonwealth was the name of the government of England between 1649 and 1660. Divine right of kings is the 17th century idea that the king or monarch was appointed by God and could do what they liked. A monarch is the king or queen, the head of a country. The new model army was Parliament's army created in 1645 during the English Civil War. It was disciplined and well organised. Parliament is a group of people, which was men until the 20th century, running the country alongside the monarch. It comes from the French word parler, which means to speak. A parliamentarian, a supporter of Parliament, who are also known as the Roundheads. Provenance is where something comes from. In sources, it means who made it, when and why, i.e. for what purpose. A Puritan is a strict Protestant. There were many Puritans during this time. Oliver Cromwell himself was an example of a Puritan. And many Puritan ideas were very at the forefront of changes that came into England in the 1650s. Radical is when people have new ideas that are different from what most people have or what people have previously had. A royalist is the support of the king during the English Civil War, also known as cavaliers. A siege is a military operation where a building or town is surrounded to cut off supplies. This is what happened to Helmsley Castle in 1644. And treason is a crime where you betray the monarch or your country. This is what King Charles I is charged with in 1649. So these are the lessons that we've looked at. So if you're watching this to catch up, then these are the different lessons that we focused on in our curriculum. Our meanwhile elsewhere for this topic was on the topic of Jamestown. So in lesson 1, we learnt about what the story of Lucy Hay told us about the era of the English Civil War. Some key concepts we were introduced to during that time were Parliament, Civil War, monarch, and the idea of the world turned upside down. We talked right from the outset in this inquiry about how sources are evidence from the time an event took place and that historians use sources to help them form views of the past. We call these views interpretations. So who was Lucy Hay? Well, Lucy Hay was born Lucy Percy. She lived from 1599 to 1660, and she exemplifies how life was harder for women than men in the 17th century. She married James Hay and became the Countess of Carlisle. She used to hold parties at court and was able to influence the political ideas of courtiers. In 1642, it was Lucy who warned the 5 MPs that Charles I was about to arrest them, and they escaped. When civil war began, she supported Parliament. However, in 1648, she changed sides and supported King Charles I. She sold a pearl necklace to help him fund his army. Lucy was sent to the Tower of London after the execution of Charles I and spent a year there. She was eventually released but remained involved in politics. She died in November 1660, but she lived to see Charles II restored to the throne. So after learning about Lucy Hay, we looked at the background to the English Civil War, and we looked at some of the main causes of the English Civil War. We talked about these historical concepts, the idea of the personal rule, the divine right of kings, and who the Roundheads and the Cavaliers were. Charles I believed in something called the divine right of kings, the idea he could rule alone as he was given power from God. And this is a central cause of the English Civil War, because Parliament wanted more power too. So the Civil War ultimately between King and Parliament was caused by arguments about money, power and religion, and it broke out in August 1642. So in terms of power, well, Parliament's power had been growing since the 16th century. It had become quite influential during the time of the Reformation, back in the 16th century under the time of Henry VIII, and it wanted more say in how the country was run. Charles I didn't like this, so he got rid of Parliament in 1629, and he ruled on his own without Parliament until 1640. This period is called the period of personal rule. When Parliament was returned in 1640, it demanded more power in what was called the Grand Remonstrance, which were the complaints that Parliament made in 1641. Now, in terms of money, the king could not charge taxes without permission from Parliament, so this was a big source of tension between them. Parliament refused to give Charles enough money for his whole reign when he started as king in 1625. Charles had got rid of Parliament in 1629, and when he ran out of money, he raised taxes illegally through a technique called ship money, and he did this from 1634. In terms of religion, members of Parliament were Protestant, and many, of course, were Puritans. Charles I, however, had shown that he was very sympathetic with the Catholic religion. Indeed, he'd married a French Catholic called Henrietta Maria. Charles I further angered the MPs in Parliament by appointing William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was seen as being sympathetic to Catholic ideas as well. Together they made changes to the church that seemed Catholic, such as a new prayer book and decorating the churches. So in lesson 3, we began to look at the English Civil War itself. We looked at maps to study the English Civil War and how each side, King and Parliament, were doing. We talked about the concepts of the New Model Army. We looked at Civil War warfare, such as the pikes and the muskets and the cannons that were used. And we also looked at Prince Rupert as an example of one of the Royalist commanders. We talked about how the English Civil War lasted from 1642 to 1646, and that the key turning points were Parliament winning the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, giving them control of Yorkshire, and Parliament winning the Battle of Naseby in 1645, giving them control of the Midlands and towards the southwest of the country. So a key reason why Parliament won the English Civil War was because they had a better army. Their New Model Army, which was created in 1645, was disciplined, well organised and motivated. We looked at some sources about the training techniques that the New Model Army had, about how they were disciplined, they didn't drink alcohol, and they were motivated by their religious beliefs. On the other hand, the King's Army, led by people like Prince Rupert, who's pictured there on his horse with his pet poodle Boy running alongside him, were often badly disciplined and more interested in taking loot and destroying towns, such as what happened in Birmingham in 1643. We then did a local focus of the English Civil War in Yorkshire, and we talked about how in 1644 the Scottish Army joined forces with Parliament to help them to take Yorkshire off the Royalists. From April to July there was a siege in York which led to the Battle of Marston Moor. From August to November 1644 there was a siege at Helmsley Castle. The castle was slighted, which means destroyed, after the Royalists surrendered. In terms of key historical concepts, we looked at the idea of what siege was and talked about why that was important in warfare, looking back at medieval warfare and even talking about how sieges can get used nowadays in warfare. We talked about significance by looking at the 5 R's of significance, about whether something was remarkable, about whether it resonates with it at the time, whether it has different results, for example, and what it reveals about people in the past as well. And we concluded that this event was highly significant for Helmsley Castle and that we can still see the evidence of the slighting of the castle today. We had a strong focus on sources in this lesson, looking at lots of local sources, such as an unexploded mortar bomb found at Helmsley Castle, and studying the letter which the steward of Helmsley Castle wrote in order to negotiate a surrender. So what happened at Helmsley Castle was that the siege lasted for 3 months. The people within Helmsley Castle, who were royalists, eventually ran out of supplies, and therefore they negotiated an honourable surrender where they were allowed to leave the castle unharmed with their weapons, and they were allowed to go and take refuge at another royalist castle at Scarborough Castle. But in order that the castle couldn't be used for a siege again, the leader of Parliament's forces, who was called Thomas Fairfax, ordered the castle to be slighted. The walls were blown up, and this side of the East Tower was blown up, as you can see there in this site evidence. So a really significant event in the history of Helmsley Castle, definitely a turning point in the history of Helmsley Castle. So that's how local events were involved very much in the English Civil War. So having studied the English Civil War, we then went and looked at what the story of Eleanor Davis can tell us about the execution of Charles I. We looked at Eleanor Davis, who was a lady who made prophecies, including prophesying the execution of Charles I. She was mostly condemned for her prophecies. Her husband burnt her prophecies. However, towards the end of her life, there was more religious toleration due to Puritan influences, allowing her to live in peace. We discussed the ideas of the historian Roy Porter, who concluded that her story shows that many ideas and beliefs were more accepted in the 17th century than they would have been at other times in history. We looked at how Charles I was executed and why. In 1646, we talked about how hardly anyone was talking about executing him. But after Charles I had escaped from prison and restarted the English Civil War in 1648 with help from the Scots, many in Parliament saw him as a, quote, man of blood and someone who could not be trusted. Charles was put on trial and found guilty, and 59 people signed his death warrant, including Oliver Cromwell, and his execution was a shocking event, signalling the end of monarchy and England becoming a Commonwealth. We then went on to look at the new ideas of the Commonwealth. So we talked about ideas like radical, and radical meaning new ideas, what the Commonwealth was, and then we looked at the ideas of the levellers and the diggers and the Puritans. We talked about when Charles I was executed in 1649, England became the Commonwealth, and it was known as the Commonwealth. And we talked about that word and about how it was more the rule of the people, the commoners, and more about creating a new type of society. We focused on how England was ruled by the Rump Parliament and then the Barebones Parliament, but how neither worked, and eventually Cromwell became a king in all but name, and he became a Lord Protector, ruling alongside what was known as the Protectorate Parliament. We focused on the new ideas in the Commonwealth. So we talked about the levellers, who wanted to bring in a degree of equality for people. They wanted to level people up, if you like. They were involved in the Putney debates and had ideas around equality in their agreement with the people. One such idea was that every male over the age of 21 would have a vote. We also reflect on the fact that although the levellers talked about equality, they didn't talk about equality between men and women, and what that told us about 17th century society. We looked at the idea of the diggers, who've attracted a lot of interest from historians. They're sometimes known as the true levellers. They wanted to set up farming communities and communes where the wealth and the work would be shared. So some people have seen this as almost being like a communist society, so found that really interesting. And then Puritans, who are strict Protestants, wanted to achieve a godly reformation. And we talked about how radical their ideas were, about how things like the theatre and maypole dancing was banned, as well as things like football during that time, and as well as some of the customs associated with Christmas. We then went on to do a bit of a depth study on Oliver Cromwell, and we talked about how Oliver Cromwell is a controversial historical figure and that historians have formed different interpretations of him through time. So, for example, he was quite popular in Victorian times when they built a statue to him, but immediately after the Restoration, he was highly unpopular. Cromwell made his name as a cavalry commander during the English Civil War. He took the army to Ireland in 1649, which saw the massacres of civilians at Drogheda and Wexford. He also defeated the Scottish army in 1650 at the Battle of Dunbar. Cromwell became Lord Protector in 1653, and he was even offered the Crown of England, an opportunity to become the king, in 1657. As a Puritan, he oversaw lots of changes to people's way of life, England became unstable after his death in September 1658, and his body was actually dug up and hung, drawn and quartered after Charles II was restored to the throne. Then in lesson 8 we looked at the restoration of the monarchy as well as tying the inquiry together. So we talked about how after Cromwell died, his son Richard became Lord Protector, but he could not rule and England fell into chaos. General Monk, who was head of the army in Scotland, ordered new elections to Parliament, who agreed to bring back Charles II. Charles II signed the Declaration of Breda, promising to pardon those who had executed his father and bring stability to England. We then focused on our meanwhile elsewhere on the colony of Jamestown. So we learned about the key historical concepts of settler, colony, empire and indigenous, and that links back to some of our learning that we did in our Year 7 curriculum. So we talked about how in the early 17th century people from England began to settle in other countries, and the Jamestown colony is one of the first examples of an English colony. And the first colony faced lots of challenges. There were tensions between settlers and the indigenous people. A man called John Smith made a map, which is a really useful historical source for telling us about this time. We talked about how their encounters with Pocahontas challenged English views about native people in America at that time, and that Jamestown is historically significant as it shows the beginnings of colonization. So in this inquiry, we've seen a huge amount of change, with contemporaries regarding it as the world turned upside down, and of course the sources below remind you of the huge changes. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that, and that's helped just reinforce your knowledge of our key historical inquiry, the world turned upside down. What can sources reveal about England between 1640 and 1660? Thank you very much for listening. Bye bye.